Hello, everybody. Thanks for tuning in. This is just going to be a pretty quick, pretty short little sharing time of some things to teach towards the latter part of Genesis with Joseph and his brothers and things like that. So let me just kind of go through a few of these things. Number one, I just gave a little review with my students that the famine came just as Joseph prophesied, that Egypt had stored the food, just like Joseph told them to. And then that Joseph's brothers came to Egypt seeking food. I then showed the little clip, a little children's storybook, children's Bible storybook video that's in the curriculum, and it's on the church website, that told this story. It takes 2.5 minutes, and it covered the story pretty well. And I told my students the night before, hey, read these chapters and come ready to discuss them. And so I told them when we were watching this, I wanted them to watch for elements of the story that are missing from the version, what was in the Bible that wasn't here. And they came up with some good things for our discussion. And then just general comments or questions about the story. And then we watched the video. And it, again, took 2.5 minutes. And then we discussed after that point. Well, then part of the discussion that I made sure came up was just in chapter 45, verses 1 through 3, where it says that Joseph's brothers were troubled at his presence. And I wanted to know why. Let's talk about why they would be troubled. And they came up with things like they're not sure how Joseph's going to react. Is he going to seek revenge? Is he going to be upset? And this is after Joseph reveals that he's their brother. And it says they were troubled. And so then we just talked about how fully and completely Joseph forgave his brothers. There's some other references that we could use there. 1 Nephi 7:21, where Nephi frankly forgives his brothers for trying to kill him. In Ephesians and Colossians, those are both references out of the curriculum that I found really beneficial as well. Then I just told my students, I gave them some time, and I told them to pull out their gospel library or their scriptures, and I gave them about 8 minutes or so, 7 or 8 minutes, to just search through and find a favorite teaching about forgiveness. I told them it could be a verse, it could be a conference talk, it could be a little video, whatever. And then I just allowed them to share, and they shared just some great things that they had found. And then we just discussed as they shared their little thoughts about forgiveness and things like that. I had a couple of quotes prepared that we could discuss that were just out of the curriculum from President Nelson about forgiveness, and then again from President Holland about forgiveness. And then in the first class that I taught this in, I came across a little video in the Gospel Library on the church website called Forgiveness. Dieter F. Uchtdorf, Forgiveness, I think is the full title of it. And so I just brought it up, and I said, I haven't even watched this yet, but let's watch it and see what we find. And it added to our discussion. And so really, our lesson ended up being all about forgiveness. And we had a great discussion about forgiveness, what it means to forgive others, what it doesn't mean. That's what that quote from President Holland included, was it doesn't mean we have to go back to an abusive relationship. It doesn't mean that we have to put ourselves in harm's way and things like that. So we talked about how forgiveness is really for us, not for the person we're forgiving, but it brings peace to our hearts. And it was really a good lesson and well received. Now I know that the curriculum goes on in this lesson, and one of the lessons actually covers Genesis chapter 50, but the Joseph Smith translation of it. Spoiler alert for next week. I will probably include that in next week's, because I think it's better, when I teach it, I find it better to be teaching about Moses as a baby and being found by the Pharaoh's daughter, and then come back to the quote that the section in the Joseph Smith translation of Genesis 50 that talks about that prophecy of Joseph. So look forward to that for next week, and I'll share that with you next week. But make it a great week. Another little tidbit for you. Some of you remember last fall, just before General Conference, I introduced something called the Countdown to Conference, and it was a good thing to just have the students get to know the leaders of the church and the apostles and the first presidency. And if you're going to do that, you could do one a day starting next Monday. What is that? The 16th of March. And you'd have one a day until General Conference starts, if you've got 5 days in a week. If you have less than 5 days in a week, then you'll have to double up and things like that. But I'll also include maybe a link to the video where I talked about that and the resources there. So anyway, make it a great week. Thanks for all you do, and we'll see you later.